class. That's crazy. How many people have anything better to do than to come and listen to me run my mouth for like the second time in 18 months here? Like, it's bizarre. I'd forgotten that I'd actually been here like 18 months ago, and so I'm like, shit, I hope I didn't bring the same notes. It would really suck if this was the same talk that I gave then. I'm going to try to do better. Thank you all very much for being here. Really, it is an incredible honor. I am at the end of a very long semester of talking about these issues and 20 years on the road, as you heard in the introduction. And yet, I want to say that there is still 20 years in an incredible irony to this. And by this, I mean this: the fact that I'm standing here and am about to discourse with you for approximately an hour about the issue of racism, white supremacy, class inequity, injustice, privilege, etc. The irony, right, which I would imagine is apparent to many, is that 20 years in, it is still easier for colleges and universities, I gather, to bring me, a white, straight, cisgendered, able-bodied male, to tell you about the things that folks of color in this room, women of all colors in this room, working class folks of all races in this room, disabled folks in this room, right, LGBTQ folks in this room will tell you every day if you're willing to listen, and yet too often we're not. Now, I intend to take advantage of all of those privileges afforded to me, but I also must acknowledge them, right? And I must say to you that if you really want to know when we won't have to have this conversation any longer, because I know there are a lot of people who would prefer we did not, you will be able to no longer have this conversation on the day that a woman of color, for instance, can stand at this podium and say everything that I'm about to say and more, and be taken every bit as seriously as I have no doubt I'm going to be in just a few minutes, and receive all of the uproarious applause that I predict will follow my presentation. When a person of color, particularly a woman of color, particularly a queer woman of color, particularly a working class queer woman of color, can stand up and say these things and be taken just as seriously and not pushed back against and not be put in her quote-unquote rhetorical place, then and only then will we not have to have these conversations. So I'm very glad to be here, and I will take full advantage of this microphone. But I want to encourage you to also make sure that you're showing up in these spaces, even when the voice that is going to be speaking truth to you, even when the body that will be speaking truth to you does not fit this aesthetic. Right? Because as long as it has to fit this aesthetic, we aren't free. And I just want you to know that, and I want you to know that I know that as we move forward. We are at an incredibly dangerous time in this country, in case you had not figured that out. I've been doing this work for a quarter century, 20 years on the road. Many of you have been doing it longer than that. Some of you maybe not so much, just based on the chronology of your life. You haven't had that much time, but let me assure you that this is both an incredibly dangerous, but also an incredibly promising moment. So it's both, right? There's a lot of danger, there's also a lot of excitement, a lot of ferment, and a lot of potential in this moment to deal with these issues of racial injustice, economic injustice, inequality, unearned privilege, etc. On the one hand, the promise is being seen all over this country, in communities nationwide, in the streets, folks rising up and insisting that issues of police misconduct and brutality and profiling will be addressed. On campus after campus in this country, from Missouri to Yale to Princeton and all places in between, students standing up and demanding that the indignities to which they have been subjected ever since they stepped on the campus, and ever since their older siblings did, and ever since their parents did, and ever since their grandparents did, will by God be addressed. And on the one hand, that is incredibly invigorating and fantastic. It is a level of ferment, a level of activism, a level of intentionality that frankly most of us have not seen in the last 20 to 25 years. It is, of course, at the very same moment, though, a dangerous time, because even as those things are happening, you know there's an incredible backlash against all of what I just said. backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement, some of it overt, some of it more subtle and rhetorical, right? Those folks who can't bring themselves to insist that Black Lives Matter because, after all lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, I know. I know they do, precious. I know they do. What I also know is that white folks have a very long history of saying all and not meaning that shit. Like we said all men are created equal. We didn't mean that shit. See? So when white people say all, we really just mean us. Really don't mean the rest of y'all. That's why people of color don't trust white people when they say all lives matter, because they know whose lives are left out. See? You only have to proclaim that which has been denied. You have to say all lives matter, white lives matter. White lives were always assumed to matter. Black lives were not. That's why we insist upon it. That's why not only black and brown folks insist upon it, but we as white allies standing in solidarity must insist upon it. You don't have to proclaim that which is taken for granted. You must only proclaim that which is not. To say all lives matter be like 1971 when black folks were saying black is beautiful, trying to reclaim beauty standards. Be like some white person standing up to protest saying, but we're all beautiful in our own way. Yes, shut up. So we know that. Be like 1984, 83, 82, the outset of the HIV/AIDS crisis, right? You have folks out in the street, gay men's health crisis, act up, demanding what? That people with AIDS lives matter. Be like interrupting their protest in the middle of a demonstration to try to get more funding for people with AIDS and HIV. Be like interrupting that and saying, yeah, but what about pancreatic cancer? Yeah, sort of not the point today, but thank you for sharing. Yeah, we got about 55 more minutes of this shit, so it's not going to get any easier. I'm getting ready to be off for a month, so I can say whatever I want. I got a vacation coming. I don't even have to worry about what people think. That's also white male privilege, so write that shit down. So. Yes. So it's both invigorating and dangerous because of this backlash. And I don't just mean the backlash against Black Lives Matter. I mean the backlash on the college campuses, right? Folks that want to insist that somehow people of color can't handle racist Halloween costumes because they're fragile at Yale. Right? Why can't you just toughen up? Why can't you just turn away from the racist costume? What the hell kind of advice? First of all, when white people tell black people that they are fragile, that is precious. In a country where had black and brown folks been fragile, they wouldn't have survived this long, right? When white folks who can't even handle being called racist or being called privileged call other people fragile, methinks that the lady doth protest too much, to quote Shakespeare. Methinks that maybe the problem is not black and brown fragility, but as Robin DiAngelo says, white fragility, the inability of the dominant group to actually take feedback that isn't laudatory, right? That's why white folks get all bent out of shape when people of color want to talk about the history of racism and say things like, when are y'all going to get over slavery? I don't know. Maybe when white folks get over the 4th of July. Because that shit happened a long time ago. We did not break away from the British last Tuesday. That is some really old stuff. But now every July 4th, we're out there setting off fireworks, eating apple pie, wearing red, white, and blue, because that's a fantastic wardrobe palette, and acting as if something that happened over 230 some odd years ago is still worth talking about every single year. See, we like to remember the stuff that makes us feel good. We just don't want to deal with the ugly. That's what people do when they live in a Snapchat nation. Do you understand what I mean by that? If Snapchat were a country, it would be us. Y'all know how Snapchat works. You send a video to your friends, that shit is there for 10 seconds, and then it is gone forever. Never to be thought about again, never to be recollected, not filed for future consideration, just completely forgotten. That's how we deal with history. So then people get all upset about Black Lives Matter because they don't know the history of police misconduct in black communities, so they can't understand why people of color are so upset. That's why they get upset at the uprising on college campuses, because they don't understand the history. They act like these complaints are new, but I've been on college campuses giving these talks for 20 years, and there is nothing that those students at Missouri have been saying, nothing that those students at Yale have been saying, nothing that those students at Princeton have been saying that I have not heard day in and day out on every single college campus that I have visited in almost a quarter century. None of this is new. But the problem is that those of us who are white have the luxury, nay, the privilege of not having ever had to really pay attention to that stuff. The only reason I know it is because it's my job to listen. Right? Most white folks not getting paid to listen, and as a result are not doing so. So we act like it's new, like all of a sudden people are just fabricating events, like somehow there's not a predicate, but every incident has a predicate. And we have to understand what those are. So there's this backlash. It's a backlash against Black Lives Matter, it's a backlash against immigrants, but only some. Only those from south of one particular border, artificially created border, I should point out, artificially created as the result of a war of aggression that this country started on false pretense. I know that's not what they taught you in 8th grade, but that's because they lied to you. We started the war, we lied as a way to justify doing it, we stole half of Mexico, and then we create a border and tell people who are coming home, make no mistake, coming home to a land that their ancestors lived upon long before the first Europeans set foot here, because keep in mind that folks who we now consider Latino and Latino are at least half indigenous, that is to say that they have a claim to this land that beats any Scotsman in this room, any Irishman in this room, any Anglo in this room, any German in this room, right? So they're coming home and we're like, no, we changed the lock. But we're only worried about those immigrants. We're not worried about Canadians sneaking in to take advantage of our superior healthcare system. Because that would be insane. The Minutemen do not camp out in dinghies off the coast of Nova Scotia, shooting at crafty Canadians as they try to sneak in. Just that one border, that backlash against those folks that Donald Trump says are rapists and criminals, and maybe some of them are good people, so he's going to build a wall. But not just a wall, because he's Trump. It's going to be a wall like you wouldn't believe. The hell is a wall that I wouldn't believe? I don't know if there are any Trump translators in the room, but please let me know if you can translate. I don't know what a wall is that I wouldn't believe. The only wall that I wouldn't believe is a wall made of butter. Is that what he means, a butter wall? Because if he intends a butter wall, I really don't think that shit is going to work. Like, I think that will melt in the southwestern sun. Like, I just don't believe him. But apparently, he's going to, because he says, like, who can build a wall better than Trump? I don't know, anybody, because Trump has never built a wall. He builds casinos, he builds hotels, he does not build walls. Actually, Donald Trump doesn't build anything. He gets brown people to do that, half of them probably undocumented. Just so that's where we are. Or we're backlashing against Syrian refugees, because even though refugees are the most vetted individuals coming into any country, even though they have to pass background checks that no one else ever has to pass, just like folks who want to become citizens of this country have to answer insane questions. Have you ever watched a naturalization ceremony? We make it incredibly difficult for people that want to come in as refugees or people that want to become citizens. We ask them the most ridiculous questions that I guarantee you 99% of those of us born in this country could never answer. If our citizenship actually relied on our ability to pass a naturalization test, we would all be kicked out of the damn country, right? Oh, but the Syrians, they're going to bring terrorism because we don't do terrorism unless there's brown Muslims around, because Colorado Springs didn't happen, and Timothy McVeigh didn't happen, and Eric Rudolph didn't happen, and 104 different names who, if I had the time, I'd rattle them off for you, who were white, who committed acts of mass political terrorism in the last 30 years. None of those happened. 104 names, and if I rattled it, I wrote a piece about it back after the Boston bombing, and most of the names you would never have heard of. It's not just Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Eric Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber. It's 104 different people, white, almost all of them male, self-professed Christians, and none of it sticks to white people, none of it sticks to white men, none of it sticks to white male Christians. No pastors are being asked to condemn white Christian terrorism the way every imam in this country is every time a Muslim happens to do something contravening the teachings of Islam, but fitting in with the stereotypes that people like Donald Trump and his hardcore supporters have about Islam. So that's where we are. Backlash against Mexican folk, backlash against Central American folk, backlash against black folks in the streets protesting police violence, backlash against our Muslim brothers and sisters, and it calls to mind something. Like I said, when I started doing this work, it was a quarter century ago, as I said, 20 years on the road. 25 years ago, though, when I graduated from college, I started doing anti-racism work. The very first work I did was in the campaigns against David Duke, lifelong white supremacist, former Klansman, neo-Nazi. I really shouldn't call him a neo-Nazi because neo implies that he's sort of something new. And David Duke is sort of an old school, one might say Jurassic Nazi, Paleolithic Nazi, not sure of the geologic reference, but certainly old school, having thought of nothing new since the fall of the Third Reich. But there he was, David Duke, white supremacist, straight Hitler worshiper, running for the United States Senate and governor of Louisiana in 1990 and 91. Now, at that time, what was he basing his campaigns on? He was basing his campaigns on the scapegoating of the other, blaming the other for all the problems of white Louisianans. Right? So the reason they were out of work was because those people had taken their jobs. The reason that their schools were failing was because of integration of those people into their buildings. The reason that they didn't feel safe at night to leave their doors open was because of black crime. By the way, like, this whole thing about leaving your door open, who the hell does that? Like, I'm trying to figure out people who say, like, I used to not even have to lock my doors at night. What the hell's wrong with you? Why would you not lock your door at night? Like, it's 7 steps. Just lock the damn door. Like, did you not read In Cold Blood? Those 2 guys went to a farm in the middle of Kansas, killed the Clutter family. They didn't think that was coming. That was in, like, 1955 or some shit. Just lock your door. Like, what is that? I don't even understand. I mean, that's totally not even on the script. I just was like, I really want to understand people that are like, it used to be safe. I used to just leave the windows open. I used to just leave cake and candy out for the criminals. And they never would bother me. Something's wrong with this country when I can't leave my door open and invite the muggers in. Like Santa. The hell, but David Duke would say that. He would say, you're afraid because of black people, you can't find work because of black people or because of Mexican immigrants. So all of this stuff that we thought we had vanquished to some extent in 1990 and 91, because he did lose. But let's not forget, he lost and yet got 6 out of 10 white people to vote for him in 1990. He got 55 out of 100 in 91. It's not because they didn't know he was a Nazi. They all knew. No white person in Louisiana didn't know that he was a white supremacist. There were babies in utero, hadn't even been born yet, knew he was a Nazi. So when 6 out of 10 white folks showed up at the polls and voted for them, they knew exactly what they were doing. And we thought that at the very least that kind of extremism had been defeated. But here we are a quarter century later, and the same kind of nonsense, the same kind of extremism, maybe not with a Klan robe and a Klan hood and a swastika on his armband, but the same kind of rhetoric invigorating the same kind of people, because white supremacists are all lining up behind this man. Right? They're recruiting off of this man. They're telling you as much. They're saying it's the best shot in the arm that their movement has had in 20 years. Right? Because scapegoating pays, right? Blaming other people for problems that they didn't create so that you don't have to look at the real deal. That pays. It works. That's why a month ago I got an email from a young man. I was in New York and I was in the back of a cab. We were in traffic, so I'm checking my email, and there's this email from this guy. Young white dude, and he says, I can't find a job. And I'm like, oh shit. I know what's coming. Right? He says, I can't find a job because ... Black people and Mexicans have taken them all. Really? Black people and Mexicans have taken all the jobs? First of all, here's the thing. Like, you can't have it both ways. You ever notice racists want to have it both ways? Like, they want to tell you on the one hand that black and brown people have taken all the jobs. But then they will turn around and tell you out of the other side of their mouth that black and brown people are lazy and do not want to work. Okay, which one is it? Because you cannot be lazy and take all the jobs. That's a math problem. Like, if you took all the jobs, you are not lazy by definition. And if you didn't, in fact, if you are lazy, I'm pretty sure you didn't take any of the jobs, let alone all of them. So, see, I don't ask much of racists because I don't expect much, but a little consistency would be nice. Like, I just don't like a moving target. Like, just pick your stupidity and stick with that so I know what I'm aiming at when I'm trying to respond to you, because that is just nonsensical. So this guy's like, I can't find a job because people of color took them all. That is fascinating. First of all, where are these jobs that black and brown people took from white people? Are they in Second Life? Where the hell are these jobs? Are they on Minecraft? Where the hell are these jobs? Because if you look at the Labor Department data, I don't mean from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, I mean from last month, you will find what? That people of color, even with a college degree, far more likely to be out of work than white folks with a degree. Black folks in particular, almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be out of work. Latino folk, 50% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Asian American folk with a degree, 25% more likely than white folks with a degree to be out of work. Young black college graduates between 22 and 27, 2.25 times more likely than their white counterparts to be unemployed, regardless of major. So even when you compare people who had the same major, studied the same subject, got the same degree, people of color, African American folk, young, recent grads, 22 to 27, 2.25 times more likely to be out of work. So whatever jobs black and brown folks are taking from white people, they are not taking them far. They're like taking them 2 blocks and they're like, I'm done. Like, that's it. Putting that job down, apparently. Right? But this young man feels as though he can't find, and here's the thing, I'm not unsympathetic to him in terms of his unemployment status, assuming he's not lying, assuming he's telling the truth. I'll be willing to assume that he's honest about not finding work. I'm sympathetic to his situation, but I'm unsympathetic to his analysis as to why he's in that spot. See, because he is hurting, but he doesn't understand why. And Donald Trump's not going to tell him, and David Duke's not going to tell him, and no one on the right is going to tell him. They're all going to lie to him because it beats the truth. The truth is he can't find work, and if he did, it wouldn't pay a living wage. Why? Because we are operating an economy that presumes mass unemployment and low wages as a way to keep rich people rich. It's one of the reasons that the wealthiest 1/10 of 1% of Americans own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90% of the American public. That's the reason that right now you have the 6 heirs to the Walmart fortune that have the same collective net worth as the bottom 40% of Americans. Think about that. 6 people whose last name happens to be Walton. 5 of them born into the family, 1 married in. 6 of them have the same collective wealth as 127 million Americans. You think it's because those 6 people worked harder than 127 million people? You can't really believe that. There are 400 white people who have the same collective net worth as all 41 million black people combined. That's not because they worked harder than 41 million black people. That's because some folks have had a head start. Some people have had an edge. They're able to hoard their wealth. We don't consider that evidence of pathology. So this young man can't find work because the economy is predicated on aggrandizing those at the top and miserating those at the bottom. Those 6 Walmart heirs with that fortune that's equal to 127 million Americans. Let's keep in mind that the average Walmart worker, 8 out of 10 of them, in fact, make so little money that they have to turn to SNAP benefits, what we used to call food stamps, in order to supplement their meager wages. So you have a company, the biggest employer in the United States, one of the wealthiest corporations on the face of the planet, here or at any point in American history, paying their people so little that you, the taxpayer, get to subsidize their shitty wages with public assistance. And then what happens? We blame the employees for being on public assistance. Do you see how this game works? Rich people pay working class people like crap, then turn to other working class people to subsidize the wages that they don't want to pay, and then bash the people at the bottom for not having enough. And this young man's mad at people of color. Really. His problem is not black people. His problem is not Mexicans. His problem is an economy that is predicated on low wages. You have 8 out of 10, and here's the thing about Walmart, here's a company that's not only incredibly wealthy with its 6 heirs being grossly, disgustingly wealthy, and with their average employee not even making a livable wage, right? But you do know who the biggest redeemer of food stamps in the country is, right? It's Walmart. So when you pay your employees so badly and they have to turn to food stamps in order to survive, guess where they buy the food and redeem the food stamps? Walmart. They make $12 million a year in extra profits based on the food stamp purchases of their own workers. Right? So they get it on both ends. They screw the employees in terms of their wages, they make money on the back end in terms of public subsidy, and then we act like they're big genius capitalists for being so rich. That's that young man's problem, right? His problem is not people of color, but just like David Duke would tell him that it was, just like Donald Trump will tell him that it was, he will believe it because it beats having to deal with the ugly, difficult truths that we have an economy that's rigged for the few against the many. That's how these issues of income inequality and race inequality intersect. That young man has every right to be angry, just like those Louisianans in 90 and 91 had every right to be angry. But it wasn't people of color who had jacked their stuff. was a system that neglected almost all working people. That's why in the wake of the flooding of New Orleans after Katrina, the two hardest hit communities were the lower Ninth Ward, and right across the street was Chalmette, which is in St. Bernard Parish. Chalmette's 95% white, lower Ninth Ward 95% black, both working class. Right? The people of Chalmette back in 1991 when David Duke was running for governor, 95% white community, working class community, 70% of them voted for the Nazi because he was going to fix their problem. Right? And they hated the people across the way in the Ninth Ward. They looked at them as the enemy, the other, the dreaded criminal underclass other. But then when Katrina came through, what happened? See, they all got their stuff jacked, didn't they? Because the Corps of Engineers didn't want to build the levees to protect any of these working class people because that would have cost money. Money they could have spent on casinos, and money they could have spent on overpasses to get tourists to the casino, and money that we could have spent on war, and money that we could have spent on tax breaks for wealthy people. So the state of Louisiana, the federal government, the city of New Orleans, the levee board of New Orleans, none of them, the Corps of Engineers, none of them prioritized the needs of working class people, white or black. So those white folks in Chalmette would have been a hell of a lot better off, am I right, going across the street, joining hands with black and brown folks who were equally poor, and maybe marching on Baton Rouge, maybe marching on Washington to demand a better deal for working people. But they were encouraged to look across the street with fear and dread and anger and hostility and resentment and anxiety and say, you are my problem, and now your stuff is gone too. See, that's how this works. This is what we are facing. This is how dangerous this moment is when people scapegoat others for the harms of a system that they did not create and from which they do not benefit. We are going down a very, very dangerous road. But like I said, we are Snapchat nation, and so we don't see it. When I say we don't see it, I don't mean all of us. Obviously some do, and that's the uplifting, positive, hopeful piece that I started to talk with. But an awful lot of people don't see it. That's why they look around at this uprising against police violence, and they can't understand. Everywhere I go, people say things like, Tim, can you just explain to me, why do black people run from police? Really? Really, sweetheart? Do we have to explain that one? See, you can get that in college or even high school or like kindergarten, because you should have learned that a long time ago. Why do black people run from police? Aside from the fact that that question implies you didn't ever talk to any black people and have never had to listen to them, which tells me all I need to know about your racial awareness. Mm-hmm. You hadn't had any real personal relationships with black folks enough to know the answer to that question. You're not mature enough to engage in this conversation, precious. Let me just tell you that. But folks will ask that question because they never had to imbibe the history. If you're white, you don't have to know the truth behind that question and the answer to that question. You don't have to understand why people of color are afraid of cops, because to you, cops aren't scary, because to you, police are the ones that come and get your cat out the tree. Or take your 14-year-old son on a ride around to show him how, gosh darn exciting it is to be an officer of the law. That is not how police function in black and brown space, just in case you don't know. The reason black folks run from cops is Tamir Rice learned if you don't run, you'll be dead in a second. Because John Crawford could be killed in a second and a half when a cop crosses his path and turns the corner at the Walmart in Ohio and shoots him. Black and brown folks have learned that they might as well hedge their bet because they can end up dead for nothing. They can end up in prison for nothing. Right? The vast majority of black and brown folks who were hassled on the streets of New York under stop and frisk, only 5% were even given a ticket for anything. Meaning 95% had done nothing that was even ticketable, let alone arrestable. Less than 2% had drugs, less than 0.2% had a gun on them. And yet the New York Police Department constantly rationalized their program on the basis of getting guns and drugs off the street, but it didn't do that. So black and brown folks know that when the police come up to you, they can find stuff to get you on. They will put your name into the database and they'll continue to harass you forever. That's why they run. May or may not be a rational response, may or may not be smart, but now it has history behind it. And we can't ignore that history. See, people of color understand the history of law enforcement in this country because they know that modern policing traces directly to the slave patrols. That's where modern policing comes from. And black folks know that even if white folks don't. Black folks know that law enforcement officials were involved directly in the lynching of black and brown bodies, either directly participating in them or letting the prisoner out of the jail into the hands of the mob and standing by while they were strung up from trees and burned. their body parts sold off as souvenirs in this country happened. And people of color know it. They know that law enforcement was implicated in the death of African American folk in race riots. Really weren't race riots, they were pogroms. That's what we would call them if they were done against different people in a different country. Pogroms against the black community, 1917 East St. Louis. Right? The bombing of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The destruction of what was at that time called Black Wall Street. Those communities destroyed with the direct collaboration of law enforcement. Black folks know that it was law enforcement that pulled civil rights demonstrators off of stools, for God's sake. Like, you just bring it into the modern era. We're not even talking about 100 years ago or 200 years ago. We're talking about in a period that we supposedly understand, pulling folks off of stools to protect the property rights of white men that meant more than the lives of black people. That's why Black Lives Matter and have to be proclaimed as such. People of color know that the police were directly implicated in the assassination of 27 members of the Black Panther Party. Our indigenous brothers and sisters know that the same law enforcement was deployed against our native brothers and sisters in the American Indian movement. See, people of color know this story because it's ingrained on their historical DNA, if not their genetic DNA. But those of us who are white, I gather, have had the luxury of remaining ignorant. And I am not blaming white people for that in this room. Let me be very clear. None of you are to blame. You're not to blame for having come up in a system that was predicated on maintaining your ignorance and your obliviousness. It isn't your fault that you were made oblivious by a system based on lies, but it is your responsibility now to insist upon truth and to move forward and to demand something better for yourself and for your children and for this country. See, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. Sometimes people get very confused when I talk about white folks. Because those of us who are white, we're not really used to being named and labeled as such. Right? People of color are sort of used to that. So I say black folks don't flinch. Right? I say brown folk don't flinch. I say white folk all flinch. And you might think you didn't, but if I had a heart monitor on you right now, even I flinch. I said it and there was part of me that was like, oh shit. I said white folks, right? Because we're not used to it. When you're the norm, you don't get labeled, right? When you're the norm, you don't have to be identified. Nobody puts the spotlight on you. We talk about race, we're talking about black people. Or we're talking about Mexicans, or we're talking about Asian folk, or we're talking about Arab folk, or whatever, right? We're never talking about white folks. So, first of all, people get confused because of that. Secondly, they assume that if you say white folks, you must hate white people. Which is fascinating because, like, people called white came up with that name for ourselves, and now we don't like it? Like we didn't have to use that name. That was some stuff that we contrived, right? If you know the history, you know that people of European descent had never ever called themselves white before. We didn't think of ourselves as one big happy family. Are you kidding? Europeans have spent most of our history killing each other. That's how much we thought of ourselves as a tribe. We hated each other. Whiteness was something that got put on us in the colonies of what became the United States. We weren't white, so we got here, right? And now, so we come up with the name because we're trying to create this big team, right? We're trying to like make our team bigger. So we decide to call ourselves white because that makes our team. And then somebody says white folks, and you're like, well, that's racist. Well, it's just a name you came up with. The hell, how can that be racist? You're the one that came up with the name. But people get all nervous. You hate white people. My God, you talk about white. I love me some white people. I want to be real. I don't want to be misunderstood. There's a lot of things that I say that, I speak really fast, and sometimes it's like, I don't quite know if I caught that. I think I might have misunderstood. It's cool, but don't misunderstand this. I don't hate white people. I love white people. My wife is white. I love her. Our daughter's white. Which is what happens. Just in case you didn't know that. Love them. My mom, nice white lady. I love her. My dad, I don't get along. But it's not because of the white thing. It's about some other shit that I don't have enough money in my pocket to pay the therapy to figure that out. So it's not about white people, it's about whiteness. You understand? Whiteness as a system of thought, as a system of institutional behavior, And the good news is that's a system that so-called white people have at various points resisted. We don't have to fall prey to it. We don't have to follow it. And we don't have to ratify it and call it good. But in order to move beyond it, we're going to have to challenge it directly. So we can't just go along. It's like what Bev Tatum says when she uses the analogy of the President Emeritus down at Spelman. Right? She says, it's like being at the airport on the moving sidewalk, right? You ever get on a moving sidewalk, you don't have to actually pick up your feet, right? You can just stand still. You don't have to do anything. That's the beauty of the moving sidewalk. You don't have to do anything. You can just stand there, be lazy as hell, tired. You don't have to move, and it will get you from point A to point B on its own because it's programmed to do that, right? So what that means is if you try to stay in a neutral position where you're not actively facilitating inequity or actively resisting it, it's like the moving sidewalk. You'll end up where the system wants to take you. The only option you have is to turn around on the sidewalk and walk in the opposite direction. That's a choice that we can all make. People of color, by and large, have made it. Those of us who are white, by and large, have not. This obliviousness is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. To give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about this obliviousness, let me be clear. The CNN Kaiser Family Foundation poll that came out last month, 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, found what? The same thing that pretty much every one of these surveys has found forever, which is, first of all, not surprisingly, that people of color and white folks have profoundly different opinions about the extent of racism in the modern era. And that white folks are far less likely not only to believe that discrimination is a big problem, but far less likely to even recognize disparities at all between people of color and white folks. So it's not just that we don't want to ascribe the disparities to racism, we just don't even see the disparities. Like most people who are white in this country, apparently, according to the survey data, think that white folks and people of color are essentially on a level playing field and we have the exact same outcomes in health and identical outcomes in education and similar incomes and similar wealth, right? In contravention of all the data. Even though in every single category of well-being, white folks are far better off and people of color far worse, the vast majority of white folks do not see it. As I said before, those unemployment data certainly make the case. You heard in the introduction some of the wealth data. Typical white family, 17 times the net worth of the typical African American family, 13 times that of the typical Latino family, 50% more than the typical Asian American family. I should also point out that the typical white household headed by a high school dropout, the typical white household headed by a high school dropout has twice the net worth on average of the typical black household headed by a college graduate. Let me repeat. The typical white household headed by a high school dropout has twice the net worth on average of the typical black household headed by a college graduate. And yet the vast majority of white Americans apparently see very little inequality, or at least if it's there, they'll say, well, it's their fault, they should have gotten more education. Well, it's a household headed by a college graduate, half the net worth of the white household headed by the high school dropout. White college graduates between 25 and 29, male, earning approximately 1/3 more on average than black male college graduates between the ages of 45 and 49 with 20 years more work experience. So what's going on? Clearly something that the vast majority of us who are white don't have to see. We don't have to think about inequality in the justice system. I don't just mean the disproportionate killing of black and brown men and women. That's certainly one thing that our attention has been focused on lately, as it should be, of course, but it's not just that. That's the dramatic example. There's the day-to-day, putting aside the obvious cases, the Tamir Rices, and the John Crawfords, and the Sandra Blands, and the Rakia Boyds, and Laquan McDonald, and others. Putting those cases to the side for a second, we can just talk about the day-to-day way in which people of color experience law enforcement and what that means both for them and for those of us who don't face that. Because when white folks say that we can't really see any major disparities, we're obviously not looking very hard. We know that white folks, black folks, and Latinos use drugs, sell drugs, possess drugs at roughly the same rate, but that black folks are 4 times more likely to be arrested for a weed offense, 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug offense, not because they break the law more when it comes to drugs, they absolutely do not, but because that is how law enforcement has been deployed overwhelmingly in this country in spite of equal rates of law breaking with regard to that offense. Now, I personally didn't have to look up the data on that, though I did. I could have told you from personal experience that the war on drugs was not about drugs. Because if the war on drugs were actually about drugs, I'm not altogether sure who would be giving this lecture to you tonight, but I'm fairly confident it wouldn't be me. Because I don't think they let you Skype in the talk from prison, and that is where I would be if the war on drugs were actually about the use or selling of illegal narcotics. And I can tell you all this now because the statute of limitations has expired. Can't do nothing to me now. I've Googled it, trust me. And I don't do that anymore. My asthma came back, I'm done. I'm done. Just saying, it's not about drugs, it's about something else. In fact, it's so much, and I know sometimes you throw these numbers out like 4 times more likely to be arrested for weed, 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated, and our eyes sort of glaze over. That sounds like a big deal, but let's break it down in human terms. You really understand what it means, right? Because sometimes when you have numbers, you need to break them down, actually understand the human impact. So, about 6 months ago, 7 months ago, I was curious. What does that really look like in raw numbers? Like how many black folk, for instance, are being saddled with a criminal record because of the disproportionate enforcement of drug laws in black communities? And how many white folks are not being saddled with a record who would be, but for the disproportionate enforcement of the drug war, right? And I was like, how do I figure that out? And then it hit me, right? It's not that hard. You just go and you look at the FBI data first on the arrest numbers, right? You figure out, okay, how many black folk and how many white folk are arrested each year for drug possession. That's easy to find. And then you compare that to the data from the Centers for Disease Control and from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which will give you the data on drug use. That is to say, who's actually breaking these laws, right? And then you compare them percentage-wise to figure out what's the surplus black arrest number and what's the under arrest numbers for white folks relative to what would happen in a more fair system, right? If arrests actually mirrored violation rates. You can do that. It's not a real hard calculation. It takes about 15 minutes, right? So I crunched these numbers, and what I found was that every single year in this country, at least 160,000 African Americans are being arrested every year for drug possession who would not be arrested but for the disproportionate enforcement of drug laws in black communities. In other words, that's the surplus of black folks arrested who wouldn't be if the system were fairly enforced. And likewise, there are roughly 160,000 white Americans every year who are not arrested, who would be arrested, but for the privileging of whiteness within the justice system. See, that's the flip side piece, because sometimes we'll admit the downside, we don't want to look at the upside. That's why that CNN Kaiser Family Foundation poll, really interesting, one of the most interesting findings in it was where white folks said, 6 out of 10 of us actually, are honest enough to say, yes, I think my race has probably provided me with some benefits. Like, that was interesting. I didn't expect 6 out of 10 to own that. That was sort of enlightening and sort of cool until I got to like the next question, which is where it said that 65 out of 100 white folks didn't think we had actually benefited from discrimination against black people and other people of color. So race has worked to our favor, but we haven't benefited from discrimination against other races. Like, try to square that circle, or circle that square for a minute, and like work with me on it, because it seems to me that what that says is that we know we benefited, we just don't want to own that there's an implication in someone else's suffering. So when there's 160,000 extra black folk getting arrested and 160,000 fewer white folks getting arrested, that's connected. Those don't happen in 2 parallel universes, that happens in one universe. Think about the implications of that for a minute. 160,000 a year in each direction. Now, stretch that out over a decade. What do you see? In the last 10 years, that means there's 1.6 million more black people walking around with a criminal record for drug possession than would have otherwise had one, but for the disproportionate enforcement of drug laws against African American peoples, and 1.6 million fewer white folks with those records. Think about the human toll of that, because if 1.6 million more white folks had records and 1.6 million fewer black folks did in the last 10 years, how do you think that affects the employment picture in this country? Because you know you're not going to get a job with a record. How do you think that affects the college and university enrollment numbers? Because you're not going to get a student loan with that record. How is it going to affect issues like being able to vote? Because if you have a criminal record and you're on probation or parole in state after state after state, you can't vote. until you're off probation or parole. In a few states, you can't vote forever if you have a felony conviction for drugs or anything else. Millions of people of color disenfranchised permanently by those laws in this country. Right? So all of a sudden you begin to see that this thing has real human consequences. It's not some abstract academic intellectual exercise. We're talking about actual on-the-ground destruction of entire communities and the enrichment of others, because those 1.6 million white folks that didn't get busted, they get to keep on earning money and supporting their families, don't they? They get to keep on moving up the corporate ladder. They get to keep on getting that education, adding to their already existent wealth advantage. Not because they're better, not because they're more moral, not because they have better ethics, not because they're harder working, but because of the system that has privileged us relative to other people. And yet the dominant group need know nothing about that, and we can still be considered educated even when we don't know it. That to me is fascinating. How do you get to be educated and not have to know that? Simple. The system doesn't require it. And like I said, it's not our fault, but we better break it down, because when we're oblivious to things, because we weren't required to learn them, the odds are we really won't know very much. No shame in that, but you gotta own it, right? Like, I'm oblivious to a lot of stuff. Like, I'm oblivious to calculus. Because I didn't take it. And you know why I didn't take it? Because they didn't make me. And if my school system wasn't gonna make me take calculus, I sure as hell was not gonna take it on my own. I was not going to sign up voluntarily for that abuse if I didn't have to take it. I don't mean, by the way, anyone here loves calculus, teaches calculus, thank God. Someone needs to do that. I just knew it was not going to be this guy right here, that I was not the one, right? So I didn't take it. I avoided it like the plague, and as a result, I know nothing about it, which means if I were to stand up here and try to teach you calculus, you would all recognize very quickly that A, I didn't know what I was talking about, and then B, wait, what? Didn't he just say he never took the class? Aha. Exactly. And that's the point, isn't it? Identity functions the same way. When you're a member of the dominant group, you never had to take the class. So those of us who are white, sometimes we act like we know racism, whether it's real, whether it's not real, better than people of color, and we never had to take the damn class. Men act like we know sexism, patriarchy, and rape culture better than women, and we never had to take the class. Those of us who are straight or cisgendered act like we know straight supremacy, transphobia, heterosexism, homophobia better than our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and we never had to take the class. People who are able-bodied, I surmise, must think we know ableism better than the disabled, and we never had to take the class. See, the point is, when you're a member of a dominant group, and we're all members in here of at least one, I guarantee it. First of all, you're on a college campus. That right there puts you in a privileged group relative to 99.99999% of the world's population. So you already have at least one identity where you're the dominant group, and as a result, there's lots of stuff you don't have to think about. And it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you an awful human being. It makes you human in a system that's allowed you to remain stone cold stupid about some stuff. The key is, when a system has allowed you to remain stone cold stupid, just admit that you do not know what you do not know, and then listen to the ones who have had to know it all their lives just so they don't die. We'll just start with that. It's sort of like that movie, The Matrix. The blue pill and the red pill from The Matrix, right? So Lawrence Fishburne's character, Morpheus, offers Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, a blue pill and a red pill early on in the movie, right? And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but not by much, he says, you can take either of these you want. You take the blue pill, and the story ends. And you wake up, and you'll know nothing, you'll understand nothing, you can remain oblivious. That's what everybody else does. They don't want to know the truth of what's really going on in this society. They would rather die than know the truth. Or you can take the red pill, he said, and if you take the red pill, you will have enlightenment. I will take you down the rabbit hole. I will show you just how far it goes, and you will begin to see all of the things that you never had to see before. Now, Neo takes the red pill, and if you've seen the movie, right, he starts to see all the stuff that was going on in the background that most people don't know is happening, and it blows his mind, right? Look at all this stuff that's happening. That's how identity functions, right? To be a member of a dominant group is to be on the blue pill like a blue pill IV drip. Like, you don't even have to know what's happening. Like, you can be white and be on the racial blue pill IV, not even know it's attached to your arm. People of color come up to you like, don't you see all this racism? And we're like, no, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I got blue pill IV, I'm on the blue pill. What? You know? They're on the red pill because they're trying to figure out what the hell's happening in their life. Like, how to make sense of what they're experiencing. Men, we can take the blue pill, and I know that means some different shit in the modern era, I realize that. Men taking the blue pill, that means some different stuff. I like how y'all all get that joke. I don't know. I guess it means Pfizer is making money from somebody. See, that's the power of capitalism. Pharmaceuticals sell you stuff so much that I say men in blue pill, and you're all like, yes. I know exactly what that means. Marketing, it's brilliance, right? But men can take the blue, not the Pfizer blue pill, the Matrix blue pill. Get back on track now. Men can take the Matrix blue pill and remain oblivious to all the stuff that women have to begin to try to understand just in order to survive and navigate their day. Right? People with money can take a blue pill vis-a-vis working class and lower income folk, not have to really sweat the things that they sweat or even know about the things that they sweat. Like I used to be a community organizer when I lived in New Orleans, and I worked in public housing for like 15 months as an organizer, right? And during that time, okay. Yay. So I was a community organizer for 15 months, and during that time I would sometimes tell people like what I did, right? Because people ask you, you know. And you know, the problem in New Orleans is when people ask you what you do, you're often at a bar. Never a good time to have this conversation. And so people would say, what do you do? And I would tell them, and then they would always, and I do mean always, offer unsolicited advice about what those people need to do. Right? Probably experienced this. Right? They'll say things like, and they think they mean well, and they think this isn't remotely offensive, but they would say things like, you know what they need to do in public housing with those people is we need to send some corporate executives into the projects. Yeah, no, that's exactly appropriate, actually. It's a little early, but it's totally appropriate. Punchline is coming, but I appreciate your setup. Yeah, we should send these corporate executives into the projects. Why? So they can teach poor people how to manage money. Yeah. Here's the thing about that. Like, you're going to send a millionaire into the projects to tell poor people how to manage money? Give me a couple million. I'll manage. That doesn't take skill. In fact, it takes so little skill that if you have a couple million, you don't even manage your own money. You hire somebody else to do that for you. So you should even get credit when they manage it well and you make more, because you didn't even do that. Right? So these guys are like, yeah, let's send rich people in to tell. I'll tell you, it doesn't take any skill to manage millions of dollars. You know what it does take? It takes a hell of a lot of skill to keep your family alive on $357 a month, because that's what those women were doing in public housing in the city of New Orleans. $357 a month in combined AFDC and food stamps on average, and they somehow managed to keep their children from starving to death and sleeping on the street. That takes skill. We ought to send them up St. Charles Avenue, down Audubon Place in New Orleans to the dorms at Tulane where I went to college, and let them teach privileged, affluent, mostly white children how to live on less. That would actually be important and interesting and valuable. But see, we who have money or come from any level of economic affluence or even comfort and stability can look down upon the poor and look at them as pathological and deviant and flawed, because we've never actually had to meet with them. We've never actually had to know them. We never actually had to have a relationship with anyone in those spaces. So we have the luxury of obliviousness, the privilege of being stone cold ignorant to other people's truth. And once again, there's no shame in it. The only shame is refusing to get loose from it and refusing to insist on better. See, I think we're capable of better than that. I think we're capable of better than being oblivious. We're an incredibly industrious, intelligent, capable set of people in this country, and I think mostly caring and compassionate. But when you feed caring and compassionate people a bunch of lies, and when you teach them history like Snapchat, where it comes across for 10 seconds and then it's gone, you never have to think about it again, this is the kind of outcome that you get. It's like with Donald Trump and immigration. Only reason this works is because of the way that we've taught ourselves about immigration in this country. We're a people of the lie. And the people of the lie will continue to tell lies no matter how poisonous they are. So when Donald Trump, and not just Trump, but other people, forget Trump, he's not the only one. When they all say things like, you'll hear this, well, I don't mind them coming, I just want them to come legally, like my family did. The hell is that, other than a twisted understanding of your history? First of all, the idea that your great-great-great-grandfather from Europe came legally That's a technicality. That's just because indigenous people hadn't gotten around to passing laws to keep your ass out yet. They might have wished that they had. But more importantly, the fact that your great whatever came legally doesn't matter because there was no law to break. So if your family came and in the process of coming did not break a law that did not even exist, we don't pat them on the back for that and call them law-abiding. That's not how that works. If there's no law to break, the fact that you didn't break it is no kudos to you. It's just a formality. Do you understand what I'm saying? My great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents, going all the way back to the colonies, were able to come in because no one was trying to stop them. That's about power. That's not about their decency or their morality or anything about their character. And let me tell you something. If my great-grandfather, who came here in the early 1900s from Russia, a Jewish immigrant, had been living in a nation that was right next door to the United States, unable to make it in his own land, the victim of vicious pogroms and ethnic and religious oppression in his own land, I promise you, he would have crossed that border without the last little bit of regard for the laws of this country, as would any of our families. The idea that my great-grandfather would have sat there if Russia had been contiguous to the U.S. and said, well, my family's starving, but I wouldn't want to break the law, is absolute crap. Right? People do what they have to do to keep their families alive, and it's no different whether they're Russians or Irish or Anglo or German or Scottish or Mexican or Guatemalan or Honduran or Brazilian or Sri Lankan or anything else. But we've lied to ourselves and we've said things like, well, there's a difference. Our people came for freedom and liberty and principles. They're just coming for stuff. Huh? First of all, our people didn't come for freedom and liberty. How do I know that? Simple. If they had come for freedom and liberty, they would have established freedom and liberty. But they didn't. Not only for African people, not only for indigenous people, even for each other. Do you know what white people did to each other in the colonies? It was god-awful. Like, you're a witch, let's burn you. Or you're a child that talks back to his parents, let's pass a law that allows us to execute you because the Bible says that's okay. That happened in the colony. That's just white people. That's just white-on-white crime. That's just some white-on-white crime. We didn't call it that, just like we don't call Wall Street that now. That's some white-on-white stuff. Nobody ever calls it that. That's just a whole nother rant for a different night. But, right? White folks were busy spending all the... We weren't setting up freedom and liberty. We were oppressing each other for not praying the right way, not being pious enough, not wearing the right clothes, not doing whatever. So we didn't come for principles. You know what we came for? Stuff. Stuff like land. Right? Stuff like opportunity that we felt we didn't have in the old country. We act like it was principle, but our people came for the same stuff Mexican folk come for today. The same stuff any immigrant comes for. And most people don't like to move. See, James Baldwin said it best. He said the problem with white people is that they forgot that their ancestors didn't want to come here either. We act like they did. We act like they were these noble pioneers. Couldn't wait to cross the ocean to come to a strange land. Right? But our people didn't want to come here. You know how I know? Because our people were the losers of their respective countries. And I mean no disrespect by that. I'm just being honest. If we don't believe in honesty, once again, we act like we were these noble pioneers. No, we were the losers. We're the ones that couldn't make it. That's why we left. The winners don't leave. Right? The winners don't get on the boat. Why the hell would you get on the boat if you were rocking it? Why would you leave? Like, do you actually think that at some point in the middle of the 1600s, this conversation happened? Like somewhere in England, there's a father wakes up one morning and says, all right, so I've got an idea. Children, gather around, please. I have an announcement to make. I know that on the one hand, things are going really well. Like, we've got this big house, we got all this gold. Like last weekend we went to the King's Palace, you remember that? I know you were back in the backyard playing with the children. It was fabulous, it was brilliant. I know, it was great. You loved it. We are so stinking wealthy and powerful, but I've got an idea. What say we forget all that and we get in a boat? In spite of our fabulous riches and wealth and power and all that, right, we're just going to get in a rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy. Like, literally, it might sink. Like, we might be eaten by by sharks, we might get scurvy, we might die. It's a long journey. Like, we probably won't make it, but it will be an adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. That conversation never happened. Because only the losers got on. My family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, shh. You might not want to brag about that. Do you know who was on that and similar ships? Like, I don't know who was, but I know who wasn't. The king. The king wasn't on the Mayflower. You know who else wasn't? Anybody the king liked or had any respect for whatsoever. He would normally keep them around. It was the people that were losers. They were convicts. They couldn't make it. They were starving. They were desperate, again, as James Baldwin said, and they had nowhere else to go. And by the way, I'm not saying that to insult. I'm saying that because there's no shame in that. There's courage in that. There's beauty in that. That immigration, that willingness to leave to try to make it better for your family, that is courageous, that is heroic, but it is equally heroic when Mexican families do it. It is equally heroic when Guatemalan families do it. It is equally heroic when brown folks do it, just as it is when, quote-unquote, white folks do it. And our inability to acknowledge that, our inability to tell the truth about our own origins makes it impossible for us to see us in them and to see they in we. Right? And to actually recognize the commonality both of interest and of humanity. That's why we're in this mess. Because we spent all this time lying to ourselves and to others about the most fundamental basic truths of this country's founding and its history since. We're so committed to the lie that to tell the truth brings us up as somehow un-American, unpatriotic, all of these things, America hating, blame America first, but it's not America hating to tell the truth about your country when you're trying to save it. It's not America hating to be honest. 12 years ago they told us we were America hating when we said that if we launched a war on Iraq, we would create power vacuums in the Middle East that would come back to haunt us. I said at the time, and I wasn't the only one, that there were children in 2001, 2002, and 2003 who 10 and 15 and 20 years later, because they have long memories, will know who did what and to whom. And right now, we are reaping the whirlwind of that. Every single one of us who said that was right, and every single person who criticized us was wrong, without exception, and yet we're the ones who were told that we're against this country. We're the ones who were told that we're un-American. But there's nothing more un-American than launching wars of aggression that make your country and its people less safe. And that's who we are today because of what other people did. Not what my side did. Not what those of us who believe in justice and peace and freedom and democracy and liberty did. What some people who believe in none of those things did. And as a result, we're reaping the whirlwind of that right now as I speak. So maybe it's time to get off this notion that cheerleading for your country is the same thing as caring about it. That waving pom-poms and rah-rah and having pep rallies is the same thing as actually keeping your people safe and building a better country. Because our children deserve better than this. And I think we're capable of giving them better than this, but only if we are willing to be honest. So we've got to talk about that inequality, both economic and racial, and the combination of those. We've got to challenge the scapegoating that we hear from politicians on both sides of the aisle, because keep in mind, the crime bill was given to us by a Democrat. The welfare reform that we now see is so destructive in poor and working class communities was given to us by a Democrat. This isn't about Republicans over here and Democrats over here. It's about people who believe in justice over here and everyone else over here. And it's time for us all as Americans to decide what side we are on. This is the moment where we have to actually pick a side in this battle. There is no neutrality. You are on a moving sidewalk. You will either continue in the direction that that sidewalk is programmed, or you will turn around and you will walk the other way. There is no in between. And I hope and I expect that you will decide to be part of that struggle. Thank you all so much for being here. Fun. It was fun for me. I don't know about the rest of you, but it was good. It was good for me. So now, we've got, I don't know if we have mics or not for questions, but we may not need them. I think the room's acoustics are relatively decent, and probably if you have a good enough voice, loud enough to be heard. So if you have a question, I'll be happy to take some. I do have, when we're done with this, I've got about 8 copies of my new book. I would have had more. I sold a bunch the other day, and more than I expected, so I've got like 8. Totally be happy to sell you a copy if you're one of those 8. And if you have books, well, I see some people have got books of mine in the room already. If you want to bring them up, I'll be happy to sign them as well, and we can also do that. But I'd like to take a few questions if that's all right. So if you have any, I'll take them and let you get on your way. And enjoy your break, since I do understand it's the end of school. Yes?
So we have a bunch of educators in here that might want a copy of your speech. It was really good.
Thank you.
Particularly some high school educators.
That'd be great. I'm quite confident that they can, I assume they can make a copy of it available to people if whoever videoed it. I'm totally down for using it, however, in an educational context. I don't have a transcript of it because I don't speak from notes. It's sort of just all, it just sort of comes out of me like a virus. But the video is certainly something that I'm down for people to use if they'd like to. That'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah.
What's the main, I guess, argument or response that you get from white people listening to you that don't agree? Where's the biggest point of contention?
I think for white folks who have a different view than mine, there are different types and there are different reasons. And some of it I think is more innocent than other, right? And by innocent, I don't mean that it's okay. I just mean, look, like I said, if people have been trained not to see certain things and have been misled over and over and over their whole lives, I can't really be surprised when they don't see those things. The only reason that I see them, it's not because I have some superior insight relative to other people. I'm smarter than some and not as smart as others. But it's because I had mentors of color, folks of color who opened my eyes to this, going all the way back really to when I was, in my preschool. I was a 3-year-old kid in Nashville, Tennessee in 1971 and 2 at Tennessee State University for preschool, historically black college. I had black teachers, were my first formal educators. Most of my peers were black kids. So I had the luxury, the benefit, the privilege, if you will, of having maybe a different context and then going to college in New Orleans, even though I was on a very white campus at Tulane. It's still a black city, and I met amazing activists and educators and scholars. And because I've been raised in that early childhood environment, I learned to trust black wisdom. See, that's the difference too. Because I could be exposed to black wisdom, and if I'd never been taught to trust it, it might not have meant anything. So the response from white people is, of course, one, there's just people that are reactionaries, and on the far right, do I expect to disagree with everything I say because their worldview and their ideology is different, and I know that. There are other people who I think disagree because deep down, even if they acknowledge that some of what I've said is true, there's a real psychological benefit, I think, to deflecting concern about racism, especially the privileged side of that. Because think about it, if I'm a good person, like a decent, caring person, and like I said, I think most people are, and you tell me that I'm implicated in someone else's pain, oh my God, there's nothing worse than that. Like, at least if I were a sociopath, I wouldn't even care, right? Like, if I were a sociopath, you tell me you're implicated in suffering, I'd be like, cool, that's what I do. I'm a sociopath, you know. But if I'm a person who styles myself not a sociopath, styles myself as really caring, compassionate person, and interestingly, there are people with sociopathy who are caring and compassionate people. It's not always that they're completely antisocial, but that's a long psychological discussion. But if I'm that person who really is invested in my goodness, then my reason for blocking the kind of things that I'm saying would be that I don't want to look at the ugly, because if I look at the ugly, Baldwin talked about this too. He said the thing with white people is that they don't want to know the truth because then they're on the hook, right? And to know the truth is to be at risk, and to be at risk is really frightening because now you have to act, and it's almost easier to just not see it, right? So I think there's that, and then I think there are others who are just simply, they're not necessarily reactionary, and they're not necessarily deflecting to keep themselves psychologically healthy. They really are seriously afraid of losing their stuff. And by that I mean their material edge, right? It's not just a psychological advantage of whiteness, it's a real material advantage. And I think, now it's not material for everyone, right? The vast majority of white folks aren't really winning very much in this game in material terms. They might win relative to people of color, but like I said, it's the top 1/10 of 1% or the top 1/100th of 1% that really control most of the wealth. So most white folks are still getting their ass kicked in this game. But they've been led to believe, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, that there's this psychological wage of whiteness, this idea that I might not have much, but at least I'm not black, and that makes me better than somebody, and thank God, because the rest of my life sucks, right? And until we're prepared to move away from that, it's going to be hard. But there are people who I think, I mean, if you think about it, why do you think all this is happening at once? Why do you think that this pushback, so let's just think about a few phenomena. They're all happening at one time. The pushback against immigration, trying to control the literal border. Okay, big new push on that. The resurgence of anti-affirmative action hostility. The Supreme Court just heard oral arguments in the Fisher case out of UT Austin, right? This, by the way, if you don't know this is fascinating. Here's a white woman who says she was the victim of reverse discrimination. But in fact, the year that she was rejected at the University of Texas, claiming that she was bumped to make way for less qualified people of color, there were only 5 people of color who got in ahead of her with lower scores. There were 42 white folks with lower scores who got in ahead of her. She didn't complain. There were 168 people of color who got rejected just like she did, even though they had higher scores than her. So she wasn't even next in line. Her ass wasn't getting into UT no matter what, affirmative action or not, but she all of a sudden decided to be a victim. Why is that case? So you got controlling the borders literally, controlling the borders of elite universities, rewriting textbooks in Texas to control the borders of what children in high school are taught about history, getting rid of La Raza studies in Tucson so that Chicano and Chicana students can't learn the truth about what was done in their history and to their people, trying to police the borders of marriage to keep, it has to be traditional because if you let LGBT folk marry, it's going to threaten my marriage. What? First of all, if your marriage sucks so badly, right, that you're like, you're sitting across from your spouse one day at the breakfast table and you open up the paper and you're like, oh my God, the gays can marry. And then you put down your paper and you look at your wife, what are you going to say? Like, I think I jumped the gun. Shit. Now I have options. like it doesn't threaten your marriage. What it does, right? But think about it. It threatens the so-called specialness of your marriage. So again, the border is special. Who gets into elite colleges is special. What history we teach is special. Who can get married is special. All of this, like the war on Christmas, because God, they said holidays at the Walmart, not Christmas. Oh my God, Starbucks had a red cup without Jesus on it. It's like, it's a war on Christmas. And all of this is coming from people, and it sounds absurd, all taken like one at a time, and like when I make fun of it, it sounds especially absurd. But here's the thing, all of that makes sense, doesn't it? In a society where certain people have always had the luxury and the privilege of defining themselves as normal. Right? So if white is normal, and rich is normal, and Christian is normal, and straight is normal, and there's anything at all that threatens to make things more pluralistic, and now I'm not the prototype of an American, I'm just one of many, all of a sudden it's like, wow, can't I get a sign in English? Why can't they answer the phone in English? What? Like this is the anxiety that comes from people who've had too much entitlement, too much expectation, and don't even realize how much that set them up. That was a setup. White privilege was a setup, white people, because it's not always sustainable. But if you're led to believe that it is, if you're told life is going to be an 8, 9, or 10, and then God forbid it's only a 6 3/4, it's like, what the hell? Gotta shoot some shit. All of a sudden it's like I've gotta blast some people because I don't have an 8, and they promised me an 8. But if you're a person of color and you knew it was a grind and you'd be lucky to get to a 5.5, then all of a sudden you're at like a 4.5, you're going our things are looking a little better. That's why these polls find that black folks are the most optimistic group in America and white folks are the most pessimistic. Think about that. That's wild, right? When you have all these disparities that favor white folks and disfavor black folks, and yet black folks are optimistic, white folks are like, the wheels are coming off. The world is coming to an end. I want my country back. Right? And it's all of this. So all of this is... It's been a long semester. All of this makes sense if you put it in that context, and I think that's where a lot of people are coming from, is they're deathly afraid because they've been lied to, and it's almost like I just want to say to people, if you just had accepted that it wasn't true from the beginning, none of this would have scared you so much. Like if you had just understood that hard work isn't all it takes. And you know, like I got an email from a guy a couple years ago that just couldn't believe he'd been out of work for 26 weeks because he had played by the rules, he did everything right, he never took vacations, he worked late, he worked on the weekends, and it's just like, dude, the only reason you thought that you would never be unemployed if you did that is because you're a white male who was told that if you played by the rules, everything would go well. And there's not a black person in this country older than the age of 12 who ever believed that. Right? Because they've all known that if you work, you could work hard all your life and have nothing to show for it. People of color could have set you straight by the time you were in 8th grade. But you had the luxury of living in this cocoon, and now it's driving you crazy. And you know what? That means you need to act in solidarity with black and brown folks because they've known their country, your country, far better than you've ever had to know it. Maybe it's time to listen, right? Maybe it's time to listen. Next question, yes.
Yeah, what you just said, there's a book called Good Black. I don't know if you ever read it.
Mm-hmm.
And the author, well, everybody should read it. The author is Paul Burnett. He went to the Harvard with the black guy that did what his mom said. You know, he didn't get arrested. He didn't hang out. He got good grades at Harvard.
Yeah.
He did everything. You know, he did everything his mom told him. Went to a big firm in New York.
Yeah.
Then he was up for a partnership, and they said no.
Right.
He sued the New York firm,
Right.
and he won like $5 million
Yeah.
because they found out it was discrimination. But my other side to the author that was white,
Yeah.
Jewish, he applied for Harvard, and he didn't get picked. They put him on the waiting list, so that means somebody has to die or dropped out to
Yeah.
get in.
Yeah.
He was so scared, he told his father, I didn't get in Harvard. Father got on the phone because he's a legacy.
Right.
My son didn't get in. The next day, he was in Harvard.
Right. Right.
Talk about legacy,
Right.
Roman, because you have mentioned affirmative action, and everybody's thinking that you're meeting a quota because you're unqualified. There's plenty examples of preference
Right.
all through from the GI Bill, from the thing back in the 1860s. I forgot what.
Homestead Act.
Homestead Act. Right. So you have tons of examples
Right.
where you hook up the dominant group.
Well, that's the thing. I think this goes back to what I was saying about America being a Snapchat nation. I gather that a lot of white folks seem to think history started last week, right? And so nothing has a predicate. And again, Baldwin talked about this. I mean, I'm going to keep mentioning Baldwin because just about everything I say, he said earlier and better. He said, that the leaders of this country have never learned from history because they've never read it. And so they can, you can actually believe that racial preference started with affirmative action. Or you can believe that affirmative action started with special things for people of color rather than the Homestead Act, rather than the GI Bill, rather than the FHA loans and VA loans that people of color generally could not get, rather than the head right system which preceded all of that, which was in the colonies, which allowed male heads of household from England willing to cross the Atlantic to get 50 acres of land and the tools to work the farm as soon as they landed here, taking that land from indigenous people and working Africans on it. All of that somehow doesn't matter. And the ongoing preferences, like you mentioned, the legacy preferences that are overwhelmingly for white folks. Anyone who believes that college admissions has ever been a purely meritocratic thing doesn't know what they're talking about. Right? Harvard's a great example. Harvard is a place that has so many high quality, quote unquote, in terms of scores and grades, applicants that they could fill out their freshman class every year like 3 times over just with valedictorians and people with nearly perfect SATs. So obviously, just about anybody that doesn't get into Harvard could still be just as qualified as the people who did. You can mix and match the classes and you end up with the same quality students. But the people whose daddies went to the school have a far greater chance of getting in. The people who can write checks have a far greater chance of getting in. The people that can pay for test prep tutors or to cheat on the standardized test, which is now a huge problem in this country, a massive problem in this country with cheating, and it's almost never by poor people, white, black, or otherwise. It's the richest private elite school going white people in the country who are principally involved in that, and it's not keeping them from the halls of the Ivy League. Every year, according to the Century Foundation, there are at least twice as many white folks who get into colleges, even though they had lower qualifications, than there are black and brown folks who get in with lower qualifications because those 2-to-1 white folks either had alumni status or they had some other kind of pull or some kind of connection, and very few people complain. I mean, the fact of the matter is that college applications are a crapshoot. If you're at a school where there are 10 times more applicants than slots, or 20 times more applicants than slots, there could be no black people anywhere, and most white people still weren't going to Georgetown. Most white folks still weren't getting into Yale, and so you got to find something else to blame. Abigail Fisher, on the one hand, couldn't blame less qualified white people, even though, like I said, 42 less qualified white folks got in ahead of her, 5 black and brown folks did, so that's 8-to-1 ratio, a little over 8-to-1, but you can't complain about that because that's not against the law. You can't make a legal case out of the less qualified white people that bumped another less qualified white person, so you got to pick on the black folks. University of Michigan case was the same thing 12 years ago, where you had people that said, well, I was the victim of reverse discrimination, but they had all of these different criteria at Michigan, other than, there was if you were black, Latino, or Native American, you got 20 additional points added to your index score. But if you were from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you got 16 extra points added. What the hell's that? You ever been to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan? The snow is not the only thing white in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's mostly white people. There are indigenous folk there too, but they're not the ones crowding the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So you get 16 points just because of geographic preference that's tied to race. You got 8 points if you took AP classes, 4 points if your parents went to that school. You got something like 10 points if you went to one of the top high schools in the state, which usually meant you were in a wealthy zip code. That meant you were probably white. When you add up all the points, it's like 20 points for people of color and then like 58 points or something that were pretty much only going to go to white people, but the Supreme Court didn't say anything about those. They only worried about the 20, and I think that tells us that our biggest problem, again, it's ahistoricity. It's not being able to understand that racial preference, quote-unquote, affirmative action has been the norm in America. It's just that for all but the last 40 years, it has been explicitly for the dominant group. And it's only when all of a sudden, I run into students all the time, they're like, if I was just black, I would have gotten into Princeton. No. If you'd have been black your whole life. Not just the day that you applied to Princeton, but from the time you popped out your mama's womb. And let's be clear what that means. That means that long before Princeton was even in your sights, you would have been twice as likely to have a parent unemployed, 3 times as likely to have grown up poor, 1/17 the net worth, twice as likely to die in infancy, sweetheart. So preschool is not even in your future, let alone Princeton. But all these folks, my life would have been totally the same, but if I'd been black, I would have gotten in. No, your whole life would have been different. That's what historicity would allow us, actual historiography, understanding our own and our country's history would do for us, and we just apparently have very little interest. Yes, right there.
Hi, Mr. Wise. I really do appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
I saw your speech last time. I did some research before you came. One of the things I think there's a lot of common ground with police prison industrial complex, the war on drugs, disproportionately focusing on minorities.
Yeah.
But I think you mix in enough half-truths that it makes it sound believable. I'd just like you to react to 2 things that you wrote against another journalist, Andrew Breitbart, in which you called for the gentleman, I want that bastard destroyed now. And when I say I want him destroyed, I am not kidding. I want to see him penniless, homeless, begging on the street for money to buy food. He can die on the street so far as I'm concerned. Your rich-ass Brentwood family suffer. In another article, you said that everything that a person who, I'm coming with the same thing. I said, I've worked in the inner cities at food shelters my entire life, so I'm definitely not someone that doesn't sympathize with the plight. But this type of hate-filled rhetoric, is this something that you think is going to be constructive?
Well, you clearly didn't find the part where I wrote in an essay, and it's on my website, and it's also on Facebook, where I apologized both to Andrew and his family and said that I was wrong to have said those things. And I was fortunate enough to make that apology before he passed, because having said those things about him, what you should also know, and you didn't mention, and I figured you probably didn't mention it quite a bit on purpose, is that Andrew had said similar things about me. In fact, quite a bit worse, Andrew had published my address on the internet so that people could actually find where I was. And so there was a reason. That doesn't justify my rhetoric towards him, certainly doesn't justify my rhetoric towards his family. And I apologized for the things that I said to him, and especially considering that he did in fact die on the street from a heart attack, I felt especially bad about having said what I said. I have apologized for that publicly numerous times. It is in the record both in my social media and on my website. Andrew never apologized for the things he said to me, for the tweets he sent my way, or for the emails where he referred to me as a cocksucker, because that was his favorite word, apparently. I had also known Andrew, I should point out, for a very long time. We went to Tulane together. And one of the reasons that we didn't much like each other is because back when he was 1 year younger than I, he graduated in 1991, barely, and I graduated in 1990. And the year that I was a senior and he was a junior, there was a cross burning at his fraternity, the Delta Tau Delta House at Tulane. And at the time, his fraternity sought to cover up the fact of the cross burning. And I mentioned this. One of the reasons he and I had beef was because I brought this up, that Andrew Breitbart, just like all of his cronies in his pathetic little Greek organization, had refused to expose what had happened because they were afraid to admit that there was racism that was going on. Now, it turns out it wasn't Andrew's fault, and it wasn't even maybe the fraternity's fault. What had happened was a black kid had been offered a bid to Delta Tau Delta, and probably an alum, we never did know for sure, was angry about that. Some racist, was angry that Delta Tau Delta had offered the bid, so they actually committed a hate crime against Delta Tau Delta. You would think that if I'm Andrew Breitbart, and Andrew said to me, I wanted that black kid, I'm the one that sponsored him, I'm the one that put his name up for consideration. Well, that's interesting because that's quite a friend that you have there, whoever that individual happens to be, that when that happened, when that hate crime was done in response to that black young man, Andrew Breitbart didn't say anything. His friend, Chet Nivens, who was the head of the fraternity at the time, said nothing except this. I take that back. We had a press conference, and Chet, the head of the fraternity, who was good friends with Andrew, comes and says, we're not even sure that it was a racist act. After all, the cross was only 2 feet tall. That's the level of courage of Andrew Breitbart's friends. Andrew didn't quit the fraternity over that, never said one word about it, never actually came and condemned the act whatsoever. And so I mentioned that to him. That is what then brought forth claims of me being a quote-unquote cocksucker and someone who should be destroyed and someone whose address should therefore be put out for the public to see. So I've apologized for what I said to Andrew. Andrew didn't ever get a chance to apologize for me, but I'm okay with that. I think that's all right. But, and it's one thing to be accused of having been impolitic and intemperate, and like I said, I apologize, but you just said that I offered half-truth in the course of this speech, and I haven't heard a single half-truth that I offered yet, so feel free to try again now that we're done with your first concern. Go right ahead.
Dinesh D'Souza, who is a well-known activist on...
And ex-con, yeah.
We are centralizing white male voices.
Why
are we doing that?
I've been respectful to you. I haven't interrupted you, sir.
Why are we doing that? He has time. There are other people who have
Would you
questions.
tell this gentleman that, I don't interrupt you.
I'm going to let you finish very quickly, but I think he has a really good point. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's fine. I would like to see, I've looked online, I would like to see you debate publicly Dinesh D'Souza.
I've done it 8 times.
Oh, really?
8 times. It's all over my website. Did you Google? Next question. Go ahead. Anybody else? Yeah. Any person of color. Yes. There you go.
What is your take on the government being involved in the killing of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, as well as burning down the establishment of Black Wall Street and the Tulsa race riots?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the government was implicated, law enforcement in particular was implicated, officials in Tulsa and throughout the state of Oklahoma were implicated in the bombing of the Greenwood District and the destruction of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, that's for sure. I don't think there's anyone who even disputes that any longer, I would hope, though there might be, but I think the data on that is pretty clear, the history is pretty clear. As far as Dr. King and Malcolm X, I think there are 2 things we know for sure, right, about both of their deaths and what we know about that whole period from about 1956 really until about, let's say the late 70s at the very least, well, early 70s at the very least, if not later, that the government had been, by their own admission in 1975 when the Church Committee had hearings on this, had been engaged in deliberate attempts to destroy the civil rights and black power movements, as well as the Nation of Islam, as well as the American Indian movement, as well as the Brown Berets. I mean, all of the freedom struggle movements. And they had done that in ways that were quite blatant. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover had openly, attempted to encourage Dr. King to kill himself, had certainly tried to disrupt the Nation of Islam and turn different contingents within the nation against one another. So whether or not the government, and I don't claim to be an expert on it to say definitively one way or the other, but we do know that the government had sown distrust within the movement against each other. They had certainly implicated or deliberately sown mistrust. And so I think that even if you can't put the gun in the hands of government agents, you certainly can say that the climate that was created was one that made the death of not only Dr. King and not only Malcolm X, but also and Medgar Evers and Fred Hampton, and a whole litany of individuals more likely. And so I think the real issue is not so much whether we can say the government did this or the government did that, but let's be clear, the government of the United States deliberately set out to destroy the freedom struggle. They deliberately set out to destroy the civil rights movement. And that's an important point to remember, right? Because now we do what? Now we have, like, Dr. King is a secular saint now, right? Yeah. And everybody, they all love him, and come January 20th, everybody will be singing his praises, including the very people who hated him, the very people who despised him, the very people who represent an ideology that was predicated on destroying him. And so I think we just need to remember that the movement was hated, the movement was hunted, the movement was despised. It was not toasted, it was not loved, it was not supported by the vast majority of white Americans. It was supported by virtually no one on the right of the spectrum at all. In fact, National Review, which was the principal conservative publication in 1963 when the March on Washington happened and when the Birmingham bombing happened, said that they thought black people had actually planted the bombs in the church in Birmingham to kill those 4 little girls themselves so they could blame it on decent, innocent white segregationists. That was the voice of conservative America. So they wanted these people dead, they wanted the movement crushed. And I think we can at least say that, at the very least, right? We can say that and say that we as a country then have to not only own that, but make real amends as a society for the role that the government played in that.
But that is something that's not learned in the textbooks that we came up with. They'll tell you that, someone in the community, something crazy, something that's totally not true.
Right.
And like you said before, they're changing the history books, trying to basically get rid of what the truth was.
Right.
This is crazy. It's crazy.
Right. No, I agree. Yes.
So this leads right up to what our education, our public school education is, and the pipeline to prison where minority male children are pumped into the prison system. Yeah. How can we do something about this? Particularly this school is known for being an education school.
Right. Well, I think the key for dealing with the school to prison pipeline is, aside from acknowledging what all the research says, right, which is that is happening and that it has very little to do with actual behavioral differences between whites and people of color, everything to do with biases, both overt and subtle and subconscious. There are some good examples, though, of schools around the country and even entire school systems that have decided to move in a very different direction with regard to discipline, right? So instead of suspending and expelling and instead of office referrals, right, moving in a very deliberate direction toward restorative justice principles. There have been a few articles recently on that. I will be happy to, send links to anyone who's interested in it, where they're taking kids who are in, elementary school, who in a lot of places are being put out of the class. They're being suspended, they're being expelled. We know that, the more suspensions and expulsions that a kid faces, the greater likelihood they're going to drop out, the greater likelihood they're going to get caught up in the criminal justice system. And instead of doing that, by moving toward restorative justice principles, keeping the kid in class, trying to get those children who are having conflict with each other to work out their problems, and teaching them the kind of skills needed to actually do that, they're cutting back on the amount of time out of class, which is boosting academic performance, it's boosting overall morale and discipline. And so I think we need to be talking about those things that work. And there's a lot of great research out there. Russ Skiba and his colleagues at Indiana University, who for years have been sort of in the forefront of doing research on on alternatives to suspension and expulsion, alternatives to this disproportionate discipline that takes place in schools, particularly toward black and brown children. And I think the more that we're willing to look into that and see some of those alternatives, the more we can move in a very different direction and create schools that really are places of justice and learning, rather than schools where some kids feel like they might as well be in a prison and the principal is the warden and they're being checked for guns when they come in and they're being checked for drugs, even though the data says, CDC data, plain as the nose on your face, paid for by everyone in this room, government data, says that white kids are more likely to bring weapons to school than black kids, more likely to bring weapons to school than Latino kids, but they're just not being searched. And so we know what the data says, we also know what the reality says in terms of what's being done, and that's why we need to look to some of these alternative models that folks like Skiba and others have identified. Yes?
Always a pleasure to see you. Just
Good to
wanted
see
to
you.
know, what books are you reading? 2 or 3 top authors that are on the cutting edge right now, other than yourself?
Oh, well. I try not to read myself, except when I'm writing the books. Right now the thing is, I've been on the road so heavily for a few months that I have not been able to read much of anything. I am reading, I've started to read several books and then get like a third of the way through and then I get distracted and I'm not able to keep moving through it, but The Half Has Never Been Told, which is this amazing history about just the depth and depravity of enslavement. And I can't remember the author's name, but what's that? Edward Baptiste, or is it? Yeah. An amazing book. I'm about a third of the way through that. I've been going back and rereading James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and I highly recommend that for folks because it's an interesting, as you know, Cone is the sort of leading black liberation theologian, does a lot of amazing work around racism within the church and the history of Christianity, and so he really makes these amazing parallels between the cross and the lynching tree, and sort of uses this as an analogy to talk about how black peoples have been treated as the Christian Savior was treated, and so it's very. And I'm not a Christian, so I don't connect to it theologically the same way that a Christian might. But I highly recommend it for people, whether you're a person of faith or Christian in particular or not. It's just a brilliant exegesis on the interrelationship between faith and the history of white supremacy in this country. And I'm blanking on the other stuff that I've started. But I will tell you this: I have a reading list on my website that I have not updated in probably 6 months or so, but I will be updating during the next month with a lot of new books and a lot of new titles. And so if people want to check out some things that they can read, there will be several tips. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I work in the cultural competency field, and to me it's very challenging, political correctness.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear from you, what is your take on that? Type of constructive language versus, being politically correct, name races as they are, or, just being politically correct frame.
Well, I think political correctness, I never know what people mean when they use the term, right? Because that term has been around a long time. It actually was the term that I first heard in the 80s, early 80s to mid 80s, and it was a term that we on the left used to use to poke fun at other more doctrinaire leftists. I used to use it to poke fun at my Trotskyite friends, that were just like, they had a real, I had a friend that, his thing, he was a real hardcore Trotskyite socialist, and his thing was like, we have to call each other comrade, because that's the way, and it's like, what? That was just so absurd to me, and we would say, that's so politically correct, ideologically correct, it was like a joke that we told amongst ourselves, and then people like the aforementioned Dinesh D'Souza decided to write books with a third of the stories or more in the books completely, utterly inaccurate, talking about how there were all these horrible, oppressive left-wing professors who were cracking down on free speech in the classroom, and how children were being put out of the class in high schools. There have been a couple other books that said Christians are being threatened with jail for praying in 8th grade and before a biology test, and this is all crap, but it's all part of this reactionary thing that says that the left is trying to control speech. But to me, what speech codes are, and I'm not saying that I necessarily support them, by the way, because I think usually they're applied in a real bass-backward way, and I think they sort of miss the point, usually. But the thing about trying to encourage a better environment and a less hostile environment is not about controlling or policing speech. It's about trying to create a civil community. And so at Yale, for instance, when all of this stuff happened right before Halloween, right, where the school had sent out an email, and it wasn't haranguing anyone. This email basically was sort of a don't be a jackass kind of email, right? It was an email that said, look, Halloween is coming. Don't culturally appropriate other people's stuff. Don't, no blackface, no Indian headdress. Don't jack other people's things. Just don't be a jerk, basically, right? And it didn't say, by the way, if you do those things, we're going to expel you or we're going to lock you up, which, by the way, that's what free speech is. It means the government won't incarcerate you. It doesn't mean consequence-free speech. It doesn't mean that if you say something racist, I don't get to call you on it. Like, you may have the right to be a racist, and I have the right to call you an asshole when you do it. And let's be clear that both of those things are true. But so Yale says, don't do this, and then one of the dorm masters, which is a very interesting terminology, they've used that term for a long time, sends out a message. She was the assistant dorm master. She has since resigned as of the other day. She sends out an email basically undermining what Yale, her employer, had said. And what her email said was, in effect, nah, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. College is supposed to be a place where we transgress and even offend. And if you see a costume that offends you, just turn away from it. Or even better, why don't you engage the offensive person in a dialogue about their costume? Really, on Halloween when they're drunk, I'm going to have a conversation with someone in blackface or in an Indian headdress about how offensive? Like, think about the privilege embedded in her answer to what the school had said. She's saying, oh, you're being too politically correct, when all the school was trying to do was just like, just think before you do something stupid. Just think. You're at Yale, for God's sake. Just think. Like, we admitted you because we assume you can think. And then it's like, no, I want to wear a headdress anyway. It's like, and people don't, like, I was on this weird thing, I was on this cruise a month ago. It was weird. It was a weird cruise. I was on this boat, and it was like this thing called Summit at Sea, and so it was like, all these tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, and then like social justice crew over here, like protecting ourselves from the tech billionaires from Silicon Valley. And then it was like 50 people that had just come out of Burning Man and had nothing better to do, I think. And so it was like a really weird combination of humanity. And at one point I was debating David Brooks on the ship because he was there. And so we're debating in front of like 500 people. And at the end we're talking about this subject. And he's going off about political correctness and how it's no big deal if you wear a culturally appropriative costume and blah, blah, blah. And I said what I just said, and this woman in the back gets up and she says, I think that you should be able to wear anything you want, and if it offends somebody, that's their problem. I mean, humans have always had a history of dressing up like other cultures and even dressing up like animals. What's the big deal, right? And she's totally right, it's true. People have long dressed up like animals, but here's the thing. If you dress up like a gazelle, and then you go into the woods and a bear eats you, I don't blame the bear. So let's just be clear that when we're talking about political correctness, what we really are talking about is figuring out how we're going to create a civil dialogue and engagement with people. We can have major disagreements. We can be pissy with one another. We can be sarcastic with one another. We can, there's a lot of ways to do that in a way that can still be constructive, but if your need to tell a racist joke is so strong that you get angry when someone tells you not to, or if your need to wear an offensive costume is just so, like, that's my thing. I've never understood, why do you need to wear that headdress so badly? Why do you need to wear that blackface makeup so badly? Why do you need to have a Hunt the Illegal Immigrant Day so badly, which has happened on dozens of campuses in this country? Why is, it's not about whether you have the right to do it. You have a right to do a lot of things. You have a right to stand in the middle of Times Square, I guess, and yell racial slurs at people. But if you do it, it makes you an asshole. And as a result, I will call you that because that's my free speech. See, that's how that works. And I think sometimes we have mistaken free speech for consequence-free speech. And the idea that if you try to shut me down at all with criticism, you're censoring me. Once again, Google the word censorship. That is not what that is. I'm going to take one more real quick and I swear we'll get out of here. Yes, go ahead.
Growing up, my best friend was a bit darker than me. And while we both did face racial prejudices when we entered a very elite private school, it was always worse for her than it was for me. And it always seemed to be how dark her skin was. Yeah. There were some people that we knew that realized, wow, that's really bad, it's colorism. And then a lot of other people were like, well, black is black. In your opinion, do you think that it should be treated as black, or should it be treated as just as big as a problem as racial prejudice itself.
Well, I think colorism is certainly real, and we see the research on this. There's been research in the justice system, for instance, that darker defendants are actually statistically significantly more likely to be found guilty than lighter defendants, even when the fact patterns of the cases are similar. We know that there's a difference. There's been some research in the classroom about the way that teachers deal with even like siblings who have, one is darker than the other, or one has a quote-unquote blacker name than the other, right? And how that plays out as well, right? So there are all these things that definitely are within the group that are differentials, that have to do with color, that have to do with economic status, that have to do with sex and gender, that have to do with sexuality. So I don't ever think we want to simplify it so much that we just say, you know, all black folks are treated exactly alike, all Latino folks are treated exactly alike, or for that matter, that all white folks are. Like I said earlier, obviously, if you're white and in the top 1/10 of 1%, your life is very different, right, than if you're white and if you're in the bottom 20%. So we wanna hold out a recognition of the disparities that exist within marginalized groups and recognize that there is definitely historically and today a reason to believe that darkness, right, is independent of the larger category, is highly correlated with mistreatment. And this goes back, you know, to the days of enslavement and this idea that lighter-skinned people were closer to the master, therefore they would be more loyal. They would be the ones who worked in the house rather than the field. They would be the ones who would basically rat out the rebellions that were being planned. So they would tell on Nat Turner, they would tell on Denmark Vesey, they would tell on, you know, whomever. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. But so that relationship of looking at race as being about these biological characteristics, which is a relatively new phenomenon. It's really not historically the way that darkness was viewed. It wasn't biologized. It wasn't turned into a scientific thing except for like the last 300, 400 years. But as a result of having done that, you know, the more drops of blackness you have in the eyes of white supremacy, the more likely that you will be targeted as especially problematic. They've even done these studies, I think, where they show faces sort of relatively quickly, and people who are lighter are more likely to actually, but they're still black, but they're lighter skinned, and then you ask the white respondents who were observing the images, they're more likely to actually remember them as white, right? But the darker they are, the more likely they are to